So we're going to start a series today that's a little bit different from what we've been doing for the last several months. We've been going through the minor prophets. We're going to take about 3 weeks off, and we're going to kind of focus on what it is that Christ has done for us in relation to this time of year as we remember Easter. And I wanted to start off by talking a little bit. I can remember when I was younger, one of my favorite things to do as a kid was to go to a vending machine and get a nice cold drink from a vending machine. I can remember when I would visit my grandmother's house up in northern Kentucky in the summer, there was a convenience store that was next door to her, and sometimes we would go in the convenience store, but one of our favorite things to do was to walk down to the convenience store and back. Now maybe for some of you, you might think I'm not old school enough, but I remember you used to be able to just put a quarter in, and you would get a can of Coke. Now, some of you'll probably say, well, Danny, when I was a kid, I only put a dime or a nickel in or whatever. I don't know. But for me, when I was a kid, it was a quarter, and we dropped the quarter in, and there was just something about it, right? Like you put a little piece of money in there, this little piece of metal in there, and it would drop in, and then you would hit the button, and these magical things would happen, and then poof, this cold drink comes out at the very bottom that you get to enjoy. But I remember sometime when I was in middle or high school, the prices started going up on the soda, and so they started having a dollar bill. It would take your dollar bill. And so you would get a dollar bill, and what would often happen when you would get a dollar bill and you put it in the dollar bill taker thingy that's on the vending machine? What would happen? It never seemed to take it, would it? And so you would do all kinds of stuff to it. You would kind of like smooth out the corners and try to make it as flat as you could. Maybe sometimes you thought if you put it in a certain direction, maybe that would do it. It was funny when I looked online this week, there was actually like these hacks online about how to do it. Some people said you put a little bit of tape on it and that would help it go in, all these kinds of things. It just kind of made me laugh. But the worst thing in the world about doing this is that you would try and try and try and try, and all you had was that $1 bill, and you wanted that nice cold drink on that warm day, and you would try, and it just wouldn't take it. It just rejected it over and over again, and then you would have to walk away dejected that you didn't get this cold drink. Now they're starting to take, I've noticed they're taking cards now, so you don't really, maybe this will be a thing of the past down the road, but there was nothing worse than having your dollar bill rejected when you wanted that cold drink. The thing is about life is that none of us either, one of the worst feelings in the world is to be rejected, isn't it? Think about it. One of the worst feelings in the world is to feel rejection in our lives, and we've all been there. We've all felt rejection. It starts when we're a kid. I can remember being in gym class, and maybe you would play basketball or kickball or something, and you wouldn't get chosen for the team that you wanted to be on. And especially if you were the last one that was chosen. That was always hard. There's just something about rejection that just really hits at our core. And unfortunately, as we get older, that rejection doesn't seem to go away. It just comes in different forms. Maybe we're rejected by that guy or that lady that we asked out on a date, or maybe, I know it's prom season, maybe you asked them to go to prom and they rejected you. There's just something that hits at your very core of who you are when you're rejected. And then as you get older, maybe you try to get a job and you don't get the job, and there's that feeling of rejection. I mean, rejection just really, really hurts. And today we're going to be in Luke chapter 19, and we're going to talk about a guy, we've all heard of him before, but we're going to talk today about this guy named Zacchaeus. I'm sure you've heard of him, because in Luke chapter 19, there's this beautiful story where Jesus actually didn't give something to Zacchaeus that he really deserved, that he gave him something that he did not deserve, or didn't give him something to deserve because of God's grace. Because of God's grace, God gave him something else. And so let's go ahead and read this story together today, because I think there's something in here for us to encourage us as we prepare for Easter here in just a couple of weeks. If you start in verse 1, it says that Jesus entered Jericho, and he was passing through. And there was a man there named by the name of Zacchaeus, and he was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. Okay, so I want to stop here for a second, because before I can get into this verse, I cannot help, maybe the same thing happened to you when you heard the name. I remember singing a song in Sunday school. Remember, if you went to Sunday school as a child, you probably learned the song of Zacchaeus, right? Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. He climbed up in the sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. And as the Savior, because we would do all the hands motions, right? And as the Savior passed that way, he looked up in the tree and he said, Zacchaeus, you come down, for I'm going to your house today. And then you'd say, for I'm going to your house today. Blah, blah. I didn't sing that for you on purpose because I don't want to put you through that pain of hearing me sing, okay? I just said out to you the lyrics. But when I think of this song, and it's a really sweet song, and it's got a point to it. But let me tell you, if you were Jewish in that day, you would not have sung that kind of a song about Zacchaeus, okay? Because there's a sweetness to it. Believe me, when people saw Zacchaeus in Jesus' day, they didn't see this sweet little man who climbed up in a tree to see Jesus. They saw a man who was a cheat. They saw a man who was a liar. They saw a man who was a traitor. Here, maybe if we were to change the lyrics a little bit, I thought I'd have a little bit of fun with this. Here's the song they might have sang. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, but a big old cheat was he. He bribed and cheated and stole from others, but the Lord he wanted to see. You see, they would have seen Zacchaeus so much differently than we sing of him today. Because, see, tax collectors in that time, and maybe you've heard this before, but they were very corrupt, and they often bribed people to get money out of people. See, here's how they would work. Let's say that you owed $100, and tax season, yeah, it's coming, right? We're about a month away from the big April 15th, all right? So let's say April 15th rolled around in that period of time, and let's say you owed $100. Well, what a tax collector would do is they would come up to you and say, hey, guess what? You owe $150. Now, they didn't get tax bills like maybe we do when we do our taxes, when we fill out the paperwork, or we do it through a computer program or whatever. They didn't get tax bills, so they kind of had to go by the word of the tax collector. So the tax collector would say, well, you owe $150. So then they would go back to the Romans once they got the $150 out of you, and they would keep 50 of it for themselves, and then they would give the $100 to the Romans. Everybody knew this is what they did. They bribed, they cheated, they stole. And so Zacchaeus would have been seen as a traitor for the people who were there. As a matter of fact, Zacchaeus would not have been allowed in the synagogue. They would not have allowed him in there because he was a cheat and a traitor. They wouldn't want him there. And notice here in these two verses that we just read together, in verse 2, it says that Zacchaeus was not just a tax collector, but that he was the chief tax collector. So Zacchaeus was kind of at the top end of this pyramid of stealing, cheating from his very own people. And so the people, they just despised him. They wanted nothing to do with him. And while the people hated him, if we look here in the passage, it says at the end there, in verse 2, it says that he was also wealthy. So he was a chief tax collector who cheated everybody out, and he had become obviously he was pretty good at it, and so he was very wealthy. So let's think about this. We have a guy who's a cheater and a stealer, but on the other hand, there might have been a sense of envy amongst the people of that time to see a man who was so wealthy. I mean, here's Zacchaeus. He's pulling up in his big house in his Ferrari, right? And he's got his big screen TVs in every room, and obviously he didn't have that back then, all right? But you get my point. I mean, the people were filled with envy when they saw this man, and so they not only hated him because he was a cheat, but maybe they hated him too because he was a very wealthy man, and they were envious of it. And if social media had been around back then, Zacchaeus would have been posting all of the places he was going, and he would have been posting all the stuff that he had and all the trips he took and all the famous people that were hanging out with him because he has all this money. People would have seen all this, but there was something that would have been missing, and it's often missing when we look at social media today. Because on social media, as we all know, you put on social media what you want people to see. See, what was missing in all this was that Zacchaeus was a very lonely man. Yes, he was wealthy. Yes, he had, in a very true sense, a lot of power over people. But Zacchaeus was a very lonely and he was a very rejected man. Now, we don't know all of Zacchaeus' story. The scripture doesn't give us a lot of background into Zacchaeus' life. But chances are that, and I truly believe this, I think Zacchaeus was truly struggling with loneliness in his life. I mean, why else would he climb up in a tree? And I'll tell you why that's weird here in just a minute. Because if you look in verse 3, it says that he wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he couldn't see over the crowd. See, Zacchaeus was really short. Something we may not see because we don't know the original language, but if you dig into the original language, it gives this connotation that Zacchaeus was probably really short. Like, for the scripture to come out and mention this specifically, it tells us that he probably suffered some kind of dwarfism. Okay, we don't know exactly what that looks like, but you got to remember, in the time of Jesus, people often did not grow to be very tall. As a matter of fact, if you were to talk to archaeologists, most people would say that most people only grew to be maybe a little over 5 feet or so, and a lot of that was because of the diet that they lived and the hard lives that they lived. People just didn't grow to be tall. So for Zacchaeus to be mentioned as a short man would say to us that he was really short. He was probably suffered, like I said, from some kind of dwarfism. So here's the thing. Zacchaeus had a couple of choices. Because he was so short and he's in the middle of the crowd, he could try to just maybe talk to some people, let him get through the crowd to be able to see Jesus, or he could go up in a tree. And that's what he does, because in verse 4 it says he ran ahead and he climbed a sycamore fig tree to see Jesus, since Jesus was coming that way. Now, I want to get back to what I said here a minute ago. Note, it says that Zacchaeus, he ran and he climbed up in the tree. Now, we would think, okay, what's the big deal of that? Let me tell you, any proper, respected, looked up to Jewish man in that period of time would never run and they would never climb a tree. There was this thing, you would often wear a robe and you didn't want your legs to be exposed in public. So to run, your legs are exposed. To climb in a tree, your legs are exposed. So we have Zacchaeus here doing something that a respectable Jewish man would never do. As a matter of fact, in ancient times, if a person owned slaves, they would often have the slave climb up in the tree to maybe look far away or to look for someone. This was a big no-no. But we see here in Zacchaeus this undignified response because he was so desperate to see Jesus. We see the same thing if you look in Luke chapter 15. There's the story of the prodigal son, and as you read the story of the prodigal son, we see the father who he runs to the son when he returns. It's this undignified response, this emotional response that Zacchaeus, as the father in the story of the prodigal son, shows. And he runs and he climbs because he wants to see Jesus. Now, why was he so desperate to see Jesus? I think there's a couple of things. I think Jesus' reputation had preceded him. He had heard the stories of Jesus' miracles. Just like everybody else in that period of time, they wanted to see Jesus because they had heard of what Jesus had done. But I think there was something else that maybe you've not thought of this before. Did you know that one of Jesus' disciples was a tax collector? Did you know that? Matthew was a tax collector. So maybe Zacchaeus had heard Matthew's story and he thought to himself, wow, he has one of his disciples as a tax collector. Maybe there's hope for me too. Maybe there's a place for me too. And so he climbs up into this tree to see Jesus. And when Jesus reaches a spot in verse 5, he looked up and he said to him, Zacchaeus, you come down immediately. I'm going to stay at your house today. Now, there's a lot in this little interaction, but something that really jumped out at me when I looked at this week was how Jesus reached out to Zacchaeus and called him by his name. He didn't say, hey, dude, come down from the tree. He didn't say, hey, short guy, come down from the tree. He saw Zacchaeus, he knew his name, and he said, Zacchaeus, come down from that tree, because I'm going to go to your house today. We're going to hang out today. I know your name. Did you all know that the name Zacchaeus, I didn't know this till this week. The name Zacchaeus in Hebrew means the righteous one. Now, wait a minute, this, at first blush, I mean, we're like, wait a minute, this doesn't match up. Zacchaeus definitely was not living a very righteous life. He was cheating and stealing from a lot of people. But I don't think it was an accident that he was named Zacchaeus, because in that moment, in his meeting with Jesus, is that he was going to be made righteous by Jesus. Because as we know, and we'll celebrate this next week, that Jesus would go and die on a cross for Zacchaeus and for you and for me so that we could be made righteous. Zacchaeus would become the righteous one. You know what? Jesus is calling you today by your name too. I don't know what tree you're stuck in today. All of us are probably stuck in some kind of a tree, or maybe we're in the middle of the crowd and it's really hard for us to see Jesus. We have a lot of things going on in our life. There's a lot of pain and there's a lot of hurt and frustration and disappointments. A lot of things. And Jesus today is saying your name and he's calling out to you and he says, I want to be with you today. I want to be with you in the middle of whatever it is that you're going through. See, I don't know that we've ever thought of this before. I know I haven't, and I've heard this story 100 times. I sang this song, Lord knows, 100 times growing up as a kid. But Zacchaeus was going through some stuff. And when Jesus called his name, and when Jesus says, I'm going to go to your house today, Jesus knew that. Jesus knew that Zacchaeus was going through this loneliness and going through this rejection in his life. And yet Jesus says, I want to hang out with you. I want to be with you. Jesus wants to be with you too. You don't have to be alone. I'm just floored as well when you look at this. Zacchaeus, like I already said, he wasn't a very popular man. You know, when we think of Zacchaeus, his name being the righteous one, I'm sure the people in Jesus' day had a name for Zacchaeus, and it definitely wasn't the righteous one, okay? But Jesus called him by the name that he was given, and he wanted to be with him. He wanted to be with him in his brokenness and his hurt and his pain. Jesus doesn't avoid those things. Neither can we. We need to step into other people's hurt and other people's pain. We also need to let Jesus step into our hurt, into our pain. Sometimes I think maybe we have to shield others from it. Sometimes we think that Jesus doesn't care, but in the middle of his pain and his rejection, Jesus was right there. In the middle, we don't know how many people were in the crowd that day. There had to have at least been hundreds of people in town. And of all those people, Jesus saw this man in this tree who was desperate to see Jesus. And he says, you know what, I'm gonna be with you. And I like what it says in verse 6. Look what Zacchaeus does. It says, he came down at once. Now, we might think, okay, well, yeah, he came down, but he came down at once. He was so excited that someone had noticed him, that someone had not forgotten him, that someone was no longer rejecting him, that he no longer had to be lonely anymore. He was so excited about that he got down at once and he welcomed Jesus gladly. But then look at how the people respond in verse 7. It says that all the people, they saw this and they began to mutter, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner. They start using those other names for Zacchaeus. Why would Jesus do this? I mean, put yourself, I want to ask you, and it's easy to really get down on these people, but put yourself in the crowd that was there that day. You've heard about Jesus raising the dead, feeding thousands of people, healing people. There's a really strong sentiment that he's the Savior that's been spoken of throughout the Scriptures. He's preached about this. And then what does he do? He goes to the most hated guy in town. I mean, how would you feel if, let's say here today, Jesus decided that he was going to show up out in our parking lot, and we all walk out, and there's a crowd of us there, and Jesus walks through the crowd of us, and then maybe there's, and I don't know who this Zacchaeus might be to you, but let's say that he walks right past you and he goes to them. How would that make you feel? Wait a minute, I go to church every Sunday. I read my Bible. I do nice things. Right, we can have a list of all these reasons why. But in this moment, and it wasn't that Jesus didn't care about the crowd. Obviously, he did. But in this moment, Zacchaeus needed Jesus' love, needed Jesus' acceptance. We know, Jesus said this himself, that Jesus didn't come for the righteous, but for the sinner, didn't he? And that's right where Zacchaeus is in this moment. He's a man who's filled with sin, but a man who is also filled with pain and loneliness and rejection. And of course, I'm sure the people started talking. That's what people do, don't they? Some things never change. They were shocked. It was scandalous that Jesus would want to be with this man. And if you think about it, let's just be honest, and in many ways, they weren't wrong. Zacchaeus deserved to be rejected for what he had done. But Jesus didn't give him what he deserved. Jesus didn't give him what he deserved. And the fact is that for us, we don't get what we deserve either. Because each and every one of us, we're a Zacchaeus in our own way. We're sinners. We don't deserve mercy, but that's exactly what Jesus gives. A couple centuries ago, D.L. Moody, a great preacher here in the United States, he was talking about this story, and here's what he said about Zacchaeus. I really love this. He said that Jesus saved Zacchaeus in the distance from the limb to the ground. So from the moment he was up in this limb to the time he got down to the ground, Jesus saved Zacchaeus. And he went on to say that Jesus changed his life in that moment. You can see it because it says he got down at once. Now, we don't know how long it took. Maybe it only took a few seconds. Zacchaeus was a shorter guy, so maybe it took him like 5 or 6, 7 seconds to get down the tree. We don't know how long that took, but that is what the work of Christ does in our life. He can transform us that quickly. That's what Jesus can do in all of us. Well, look at verse 8. It says, Zacchaeus stood up and he said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." So think about this. Think about the man who climbed up into the tree and what he was like, and then think about the man who was now back down on the ground and what he was like. Radical transformation. Zacchaeus was a cheater and a stealer when he climbed up in that tree, curious about seeing Jesus. But when Jesus recognized him and called him and he responded and he came down that tree, whatever, 5, 6, 7 seconds, whatever it was to come down that tree, by the time he came back down to the ground, he's now, what? He's trying to get rid of his money. That's what the transformation of Jesus Christ can do in a person's life. And I hope that's the transformation he's doing in your life. I mean, this is a story here, if we look at this. This is a story of total conversion. This is a man who had spent his life trying to get more and more money, now giving it away. Why did he do this? Why did Jesus do this? Did he do it to try to prove himself to Jesus? Did he come down in the tree and he says, "You know what, Jesus, I'm going to prove to you that I'm worthy for you to be in my house, so I'm going to go and I'm going to get..." No, he didn't do it because he was trying to prove himself. He did it because Jesus had called him. Jesus had loved him. Jesus had accepted him. Jesus had not rejected him. Jesus had already done the work of salvation in his life. This was his response. This was his response because Jesus said to him in verse 9, "Today, salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham." You see that? See, the community had rejected him. They said he wasn't a Jew. He wasn't a part of the crowd. He wasn't a part of the people. But Jesus here is restoring him because in verse 10 Jesus says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Zacchaeus had been saved from the limb to the ground. And salvation can come into our house today, into our lives today, and salvation can transform what we do in our lives today too. And that's the point I want to just share with you today is this. The point is that you deserve rejection because of your sin, but Jesus has given you acceptance. Because that's what happened in this story. Zacchaeus, he didn't deserve grace, but Jesus has given acceptance. Jesus has given you his extravagant love, and the best response to that is to live with extravagant sacrifice in your life. And I'm asking you the question today, how can you respond extravagantly because of what Jesus has already done in your life? How can you do that? I think it begins with first giving your life back to him. Making him the first priority, the top priority in your life. Something about this story of Zacchaeus maybe you didn't catch. In that day, it was taught that a Jewish person should give around a tenth to a fifth even of their income to the work of the Lord. And people would do that. But here when we see the story of Zacchaeus, we also see a man here who has stolen from others. And the law said that if you stole from someone, you should give them their money back, plus you should give them 20%. Okay? That was what the law said. If you stole from them, you give them their money back, and then for the interest, you would give them 20%. Very generous, right? Very generous amount of interest. I'm sure many of you would love to have a 20% interest rate on your savings account or whatever, right? Yeah, this is a very generous thing that the law taught. But what does Zacchaeus do here? If you look again in the passage, it says that Zacchaeus gives back 400%, 4 times the amount. Why? Because he was blown away that Jesus wanted him. And he responded in an extravagant way to the extravagant love that Jesus had shown to him. That's what happens. That's what happens when you're transformed by Jesus. There was a story a few years ago of a man who was in a church who came to Christ. And when he came to Christ, he had embezzled thousands, tens of thousands of dollars. Upon his confession and following Jesus, he went to the leaders of the church and told them what he had done. And he said, you know what? I'm going to make this right. He says, I can't bear the weight of this. He says, I'm going to just go to the courts. I'm going to let be what may. And that's what he did. He went, he turned himself into the police. He went to trial. He ended up going to prison for a period of time. I think it was about 2.5 years of prison. And he got out and he served his time. And then you know what he did when he got out? He spent the next 12 years of his life repaying all of the people that he had stolen from. The courts didn't require this per se of him, but he did it, he said, because that is what a follower of Jesus would do. I mean, who turns themselves in when they haven't even been caught? There aren't too many people that do that, but he had been transformed by the grace of Jesus Christ because that was the right thing for him to do. See, that is what we should do in response to Jesus' love, is this extravagant love that has been given to us. We should give that extravagant love back to him and to others. See, the way you respond extravagantly is going to say something about your appreciation for the gift. How you respond to the extravagance of Jesus says something about how much you appreciate it. And there's a lot of ways you can show how much you appreciate it. You can show it by the way that you give to the church or you give to others to help them in their times of need. It could be giving your time. How do you measure the time? I mean, what are you doing with your time to show that extravagant love that has been given to you through Christ? See, that's what Zacchaeus did. He responded extravagantly. And here's, again, the reality is that when you're transformed by Jesus, there has to be evidence. Zacchaeus has that evidence. We've seen it. What about you? Where's the evidence in your life? Because when you start doing extravagant things in reaction to his love, some weird things start to happen in our lives. You start forgiving people who don't deserve forgiveness. That's a part of extravagant love. Because you've been given forgiveness, now you're going to give forgiveness to other people. You're not going to hold on to the pains and the hurts and the rejections maybe that you've received in your life, but instead you give forgiveness. You start loving people that other people don't love. That might be another thing that happens as you respond to this extravagance of Jesus. Maybe you start caring for people who are outcast. Suddenly you start using resources to help people who are in need. Sometimes you might even help people you don't even know. You suddenly start serving, and all of a sudden, your life is not your life anymore. That's what it means to respond to his extravagant love. Extravagant love requires an extravagant response. And so that's my question for you today is, what is your response? How do you respond to that? Have you responded to that? Maybe you haven't accepted the original extravagant love that Jesus showed to Zacchaeus that he's showing to you today. Maybe that's the first step. What will your response be? Because you deserved, again, what is it? You deserved punishment. You deserved death. But what did Jesus give you instead? He gave you life. And he gave you mercy. And he gave you acceptance. That's a pretty good gift, isn't it? It's a pretty good gift. So let's give that gift to others as well. I want to invite you, let's close our eyes here for just a moment. And I've got a few questions. We do this every week, but I want us to think of a couple of things. Actually, the first thing here is not really a question, but it's something to think about. I want you to think here for a moment of the reasons that you should be rejected. I know it's not a pleasant thought, but maybe that's where you're at today. I don't know, but what are the reasons you should be rejected? You should be rejected because of the sin in your life. You should be rejected because of past mistakes that you've made. You should be rejected because of the hurt that you've inflicted on other people. There's a lot of things that you deserve rejection. So in your rejection, I got another question for you. What are you doing? What are you doing to see or to run after Jesus? Are you willing to fight through the crowd? Are you willing to get up in the tree? Are you willing to meet with Jesus in your rejection? I think sometimes we don't run to Jesus in our rejection, in our pain, in our sorrow. What are you doing to run to Jesus in that rejection today? And then finally, because of his approval, because he called you up in that tree, because he said, Zacchaeus, because he said, Danny, because he said your name, and he called you down from that tree, what will you do in response? Because he hasn't rejected you. He's accepted you.